When it comes to a lot of anime, I'd definitely say Tokyo Ghoul has one of the more interesting power systems to ever be created. It's pretty simple, but it actually has a lot of different complex layers, especially when we take in the idea that these are human beings and monsters all fighting with different kinds of monsters' limbs that have completely different effects, and they can all be used and modified in multiple different ways and make it so that you can fight in a completely different way altogether. The power system of Tokyo Ghoul easily goes a long way, especially when we want to take into consideration that these are just the body parts of monsters that are being used. First, we gotta understand what makes these body parts so useful and special in the first place. You see, this all starts with understanding the composition of a ghoul in its entirety. These limbs that make up the power system of Tokyo Ghoul have a pretty special name known as Kagune. And a Kagune would be a natural form that a ghoul would create in order to help defend itself or hunt down any kind of prey that it wants in an occasional night or two. Interestingly enough, there is actually a lot more to the Kagune than what we actually even would think of, let alone dream of, because this, once again, is just a limb. Now, when ghouls begin to use the Kagune, they end up having their physical abilities enhanced and strengthened because they are taking a combative stance. They are a lot like predators, let alone animals. This gives you a better idea as to why people view them as creatures in the long run. But let's forget the opinions of the people for now and focus more on the Kagune. Kagune are made out of RC cells, which is probably one of the main productive resources of a ghoul's body, ultimately making these inhuman acts possible. And it really doesn't even stop there, because the powers of a ghoul can only get even more inhumane than what you already even thought. When it comes to a Kagune, there are actually a lot of completely different possibilities that are actually even unheard of, that even the manga probably didn't even get to explore yet, and this is all simply because the fact that Kagune can shapeshift and really have a completely different kind of qualities altogether based on the creativity and the intellect of any ghoul or anyone using a Kagune. As I say this means that the Kagune really doesn't have official limits. To give you a better idea, I mean, it's only obvious to use the example of Kaneki. We've seen his Kagune take many different shapes and forms, allowing him to not only turn his Kagune into a sword in certain occasions, but also into a hand, even though it would be a tail attached to his back. And not only that, he could make armor or even claws, whatever he actually wants during any kind of fighting instance, because this is what he would make happen through not only his own will, but also his mindset. RC cells would also play a giant role when it comes to making all of these insane possibilities happen when using a Kagune, because their quality and quantity are the main reasons why Kagune are able to grow and expand. At the end of the day, it really just depends on the ghoul, unless some way, somehow, other ghouls can improve their RC cells and evolve, so to speak. Kaneki is also a perfect example of this. You see how his RC cells ultimately work because he eats so many other ghouls in comparison to most other ghouls. Cannibalism is what allowed Kaneki to be able to use all of these different powers in comparison to other ghouls. He would eat ghouls, and this would help make his RC cells actually improve in quality and quantity, and it's pretty obvious whenever we see Kaneki use his powers. He's able to show some of the most creativity in the series because he ate so many ghouls, which really just shows you the power creep that Kaneki had versus anyone else in this series. Now, with that being said, ghouls are also broken into a class system based on their Kagune, with the different Kagune classes being Ukaku, Kokaku, Rinkaku, and Bikaku. Interestingly enough, this would all really just depend on where the position of the Kagune is. Ukaku types would be at the highest position of the back, and these are some of the most familiar Kagunes that we'd see, with Toka probably being the main mascot of this one. This would be the feather-like Kagune that would allow ghouls to attack at high speeds, and even it would allow them to fight at a range and shoot numerous projectiles that can impale and kill any of their opponents, with their main weakness being the amount of stamina that they can have, because knowing this, any other ghoul would be able to counter an Ukaku type by making sure that they can last longer than any Ukaku ghoul in a fight. Using this would be probably the best method to take any of these ghouls down. An Ukaku type would be dangerous because it would be the ghoul that would be the quickest to kill you, and even use its speed to get away from anyone trying to hunt it down, which gives you an idea that the Ukaku type ghouls are the ones that specialize in hit and run tactics. And as obvious as the Ukaku type's weakness really is, Ukaku ghouls can fight and work beyond this, with Ayato, Toka's brother, being able to fight beyond this weakness by shapeshifting his Ukaku into a blade arm and using it as a close ranged attack so that he can slice his enemies into pieces at a high speed. Of course, if a ghoul is skilled enough, they would be able to bypass any weaknesses they have, and this would all be thanks to their own creativity and intuition with their Kagune. Speaking of which, there are even rare possibilities with an Ukaku type Kagune, going as far as to allowing a ghoul to shoot electricity from their body as an attack, which also just shows you what kind of potential a long-ranged attack from an Ukaku really has. It can become a lightning attack, and we already know how fast lightning is, which makes sense since an Ukaku is a speed type above anything else. But this would only be possible due to the creativity and the mindset of the user. Yomo would use this ability, and he would also be able to cover up the main weakness of the Ukaku, which would be close range. He would be able to create an electric field around himself so that people could not take advantage of his close ranged weakness, which really speaks to what kind of creativity is possible with an Ukaku, all thanks to the difference in experience and knowledge of one's ability. Really, this just shows us that everything depends on a fighter when it comes down to it, because even with strengths and weaknesses, you can still find ways to make yourself completely unstoppable. Now, our next Kagune class would be the Kokaku. With that being said, the Kokaku would be the same class that Tsukiyama would use. As we know, he would have a pincer-like Kagune with a lot of strength and density. However, this would come with a lot of weight, and so he would be dragging it across the ground instead of being able to take advantage of any source of mobility that he could have. The Kokaku would come from the shoulder blade and be normally used for defense and powerful attacks. And of course, with advantages such as defense and powerful attacks, that would only mean that the Kokaku would have its own weakness, with it being speed. Not only that, but the Kokaku would also be one of the most difficult Kagunes to actually use. Yet in the hands of experts, they can manage to turn this thing into a whole entire shield protecting one's body. They could turn it into a trap and detach it from their own body and capture their prey alive, only so that they can toy with them and take a complete advantage in any kind of scenario in a fight. With some Kokaku users even going as far as to cloning themselves due to having so much skill with this Kagune. And the insane abilities wouldn't even really stop there, because we see users of this Kokaku Kagune like Uda. He would be able to shapeshift and wear different faces on his body, giving him the possibility so he can stealth his way in multiple situations and fooling anyone he's fighting, letting him mentally manipulate opponents by taking the forms of the ones they love, making his opponents doubt themselves so he can take the opportunity to attack them while they're hesitating. Kokaku users have a lot of opportunities to take advantage of any fight, even when they lack speed, because they can attack you mentally or abuse their brute strength and so much more. It really just depends on how good you are with a Kagune. We would have Yurie using a Kokaku Kagune, and he would only be able to use it in the form of a sword because he was not being creative enough and his mentality was holding him back from making it so much better than it already was. And because he has the desire to protect his friends, he ends up making a shield out of the same Kagune. So these possibilities ultimately become endless depending on what kind of class that you're using as a whole. Because Yurie was so stuck on fighting offensively, he was limiting one of his options until he finally thought about fighting defensively. Then he was able to take advantage of both strengths that the Kokaku Kagune was offering him. Our next Kagune type would be the Rinkaku, and of course the most famous user of this Kagune would be Kaneki. When having a Rinkaku, you would specialize in regenerative abilities, and you would be able to survive some of the harshest attacks that most ghouls can take. The Rinkaku would also have an advantage when it comes to striking power, which allows the Rinkaku to have an advantage when it comes to its strength. However, this would also come with its own sense of weaknesses, because other Kagunes can, of course, have a way to counter this. Super regeneration and superior strength seem nearly impossible to deal with, but their limbs are actually very soft and easy to destroy. A Rinkaku can go through a Kokaku's defense, which gives you a decent idea on how this class system would work, with certain Kagunes having strengths and weaknesses depending on what kind of Kagune they're fighting. A Bikaku Kagune would be the perfect counter for a Rinkaku, because a Bikaku would have higher strength than a Rinkaku Kagune and completely overpower a Rinkaku with just strength alone. A Rinkaku would also have RC cells that bind together easily, which comes at the price of the Rinkaku itself being easy to break, making the Rinkaku a double-edged sword because it can break through the defenses of a Kokaku, but it can also be broken through pretty easily. When it comes to the creative aspect of Rinkaku users, we see Psycho form a net out of her Rinkaku and also turn this same Kagune into giant arms, multiple arms at once, and also, in reference of Kaneki, turn the same power into the form of a centipede, detach a Rinkaku and form a cage with it, or even a mask as armor. And instead of just being limited to only 4 tentacles, he can make more than that and also increase their size, or change the form of the Rinkaku from a tentacle into a blade. There's really a lot that can be done with the Rinkaku, but above all else, I do think the best attribute that it can offer, superior regeneration in comparison to anything else. Last but certainly not least, we have the Bikaku class. As I mentioned before, it is a direct counter to the Rinkaku class, but the Bikaku still has its own merits outside of that. The Bikaku, also like the Ukaku, would have its advantages at fighting at a range. However, this range would be limited to the Bikaku, only allowing you to strike at a medium distance for an attack. With that being said, the Ukaku would definitely counter the Bikaku in every which way by having not only a longer distance to attack from, but also speed that could completely back up and overwhelm a Bikaku easily. Now, to get a better idea of what a Bikaku is capable of, let's look at some of the crazier things that this Bikaku can do. We've seen Bikaku users such as Tadara actually use their RC cells and make it so they can spew flames out of their mouths while using a Bikaku Kagune. And this would all be due to the RC cell concentration stored in his body. Nora would also be a Bikaku user that actually stands out because unlike the Rinkaku, he is still able to have absurd regeneration, if not some of the best regenerative abilities we've seen in the series, while possessing a Bikaku, which is not known to excel in that area. Nora would be able to turn his Kagune itself into a giant mouth and devour opponents with a single swipe of his Kagune, and he would even be able to split this same Kagune into multiple different forms and create different amounts of it. And another interesting ability that we would have would come from Mutsuki, with Mutsuki being able to actually copy anyone else's Kagune and using their same abilities, all due to her mindset and shape-shifting abilities. There's actually a lot of potential with each and every single Kagune type, but there's also one that is very interesting in of itself, with it being the Chimera Kagune type, which allows multiple types of Kagunes to be made. You can have people such as Nutcracker being able to use the Kokaku Kagune and the Bikaku. She would use her Kokaku for defense and for offensive attacks, making it pretty hard to get in against her, and she would also use the length of her Bikaku as traversal, and she would also put pieces of it and hide them in certain locations and make her Bikaku into traps that reside in any location. Having multiple Kagune would easily put a Ghoul in a completely different league. Now that we got the way a Ghoul fights out of the way, I think it's only natural to talk about the Quinque. Ironically enough, the Quinque would be made up of the same Kagune that Ghouls use to fight, but the CCG would turn these into their own artificial weapons. The CCG would turn a Kagune into a blade, allowing this Kagune to even extend into a two-sworded weapon, allowing anyone to easily cut through Ghouls and even use another sword as a projectile, or mix a Ghoul up by having them assume what kind of weapon you already have. You would even have a Quinque known as Igura, which starts out as a lance and would allow Arima to pierce anyone easily with just the tip of the weapon. This same lance would easily be able to turn into a shield by being mounted inside of the ground, and would have the ability to turn into a mine that can attack anyone that comes into contact with it, letting this weapon have offensive, defensive, and even the ability to trap any opponent. It doesn't even stop there. You would have a wide array of knives that can be thrown and used to cut up opponents very easily. Allowing 56 of these to be used in total, you can fight people back at a range and even destroy a Ghoul in close quarters because you would be able to pierce their flesh with these knives like it was nothing. This isn't even taking into consideration how deceptive a Quinque can really be, because by having just a Quinque, any opponent would assume what kind of weapon you have, but with any kind of gimmick out of a Quinque, you could make it so that you can trick a person by fighting them with an attachment that they didn't know was already on your weapon, which could be all the difference between life and death as a CCG operative. The CCG would be able to make guns, hammers, and katanas out of Kagune, and destroy any ghouls that they come into combat with. There'd even be Quinques that would be specifically designed for bare-handed fighting styles. The Quinque's craziness doesn't even stop there, because you can have an RPG that has homing missiles that can fight at a long range, then split into 2 different pieces, allowing you to have a sword and shield right after using a long-range weapon. Just like a Kagune, a Quinque possesses a lot of possibilities, making fighting for an ideal situation endless. Now, after understanding the weapons of the CCG and the ghouls, it would only be natural to get an idea on what kind of enhancements that they would use whenever they're trying to kill each other. How can both of these factions get stronger and go beyond their own limits? When it comes to ghouls, this would originate through ghoul cannibalism, having them evolve into a Kakuja state. A Kakuja would be an evolved Kagune state, which makes the ghoul take in more RC cells, which causes a ghoul to develop a new type of armor, with that armor being a Kakuja, which allows their Kagune to also evolve and do things that you would never even expect. With Kanaki's Kakuja being a prime example of this, ghouls would begin to metamorphosize and mutate their own bodies and Kakuja to take the form that their mind would imagine. Because he was tortured by the centipede, Kaneki would envision the centipede through his trauma, and then his Kakuja would then take this same exact form because of his imagination, which is just like the flames that Tadara attacks the CCG members with, because he would envision his own hatred engulfing and burning everything down, being fuel for his insides. He would end up being able to actually create fire. The CCG would even use Kakujas against ghouls themselves by turning them into Arata units, and these units would allow a CCG member to move at an explosive speed and have strength that would end up surpassing the human limit, and this would come at the cost of the suit itself devouring them, making this suit a double-edged sword. You would be able to fight beyond your limits, but it would be at the cost of your own life. The Arata would end up being a huge deciding factor for the CCG because it would allow them to keep up with ghouls that were in a Kakuja-like state. These Arata units would also even improve the defense of any CCG operative, letting a normal human compete with some of the strongest ghouls, which wouldn't even be possible without this Arata. With this, the CCG would be able to fight fire with fire, which would only be necessary in this massive war between ghouls and humans. With that being said, these are the means of how every fight would begin and even end in Tokyo Ghoul. Kagunes would allow ghouls to eat and even defend themselves, yet these same limbs would be the overall source of power and violence between the CCG and ghouls alike.